I'm a 30-year-old woman, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been pretty stable. I come from a financially comfortable background. My parents owned a successful business, and when they passed away, I inherited it. That business has allowed me to live a life without worrying about money. I've always been smart about finances, too. I have advisors who've helped guide me through everything. So, when I met my husband 5 years ago, money wasn't something I ever expected to cause problems. I was working at a tech company in a high-paying executive position when I met him. He's 32 now, but back then we were both pretty immersed in our careers. He was working in middle management at the same company, and from the start, he was charming and ambitious. We clicked right away. He had big dreams of starting his own business one day, and I loved that about him. I admired his drive, and it felt like we were on the same page about life, goals, and everything in between. At least that's what I thought. From the very beginning of our relationship, I made it clear that we should keep our finances separate. This wasn't something I just came up with on my own. My financial advisors had recommended it, and it made sense to me. I didn't want money to complicate things. He seemed okay with it at first, but looking back, I realized that might have been the first sign of trouble. A few months into dating, he started making little comments about how weird it felt that I earned more than him. At the time, I brushed it off. I didn't think it was a big deal. After all, I wasn't the kind of person to make it an issue, and I didn't think he was either. But the comments kept coming, subtly at first. Then they turned into full-on complaints. He'd say things like, "It's hard being the guy in the relationship when you make so much more." I still didn't take it too seriously. I figured he just needed time to adjust. 2 years into dating, everything changed. He lost his job because of company-wide layoffs. I remember feeling so bad for him. He had always been the ambitious, go-getter type, and this seemed to really shake him. I tried to be supportive. I told him it wasn't his fault and that he'd bounce back. He promised me he would. At first, I didn't mind covering more of the expenses. I mean, it was temporary, right? Or so I thought. As time went on, though, it started to feel less temporary. He wasn't finding another job, but he wasn't really trying that hard either. He'd talk about his big plans to start a business, but nothing ever seemed to materialize. Meanwhile, I was paying for more and more rent, vacations, dinners out. He contributed almost nothing financially, but he always had a reason for why his big break was just around the corner. Then, out of nowhere, he proposed. Despite everything, I said yes. I loved him, and I believed in him. I thought things would get better once we were married. The idea of a prenup came up briefly, but he brushed it aside so quickly that I didn't push the issue. I was in love, and it felt like we didn't need to worry about something like that. Looking back, I wish I had listened to my gut. After we got married, things got worse. His business ideas became more inconsistent and half-baked. He'd spend days working on these projects that never seemed to go anywhere. Meanwhile, I was still the one supporting us financially. He was more than comfortable with that. In fact, he seemed to be enjoying it, living a lifestyle funded entirely by me while doing the bare minimum to contribute. Every time I'd ask him of his business ventures, he'd have some excuse for why they hadn't succeeded yet. It was always someone else's fault, or there was some obstacle he just couldn't overcome. A year into the marriage, I discovered something that completely shattered my trust. I found out he had been taking out loans in my name to fund his failing ventures. I only realized it when I came across a pile of credit card statements that didn't make sense. He had lied to me for months. When I confronted him, he broke down. He told me he didn't know how to handle being the poor one in the relationship, and that taking the loans was his way of trying to prove himself. I was devastated. It wasn't just the money, it was the lies. I had been there for him, supported him, and this was how he repaid me. After a series of heated arguments, I made the decision to separate our finances entirely. He agreed, but I could tell he was angry about it. His resentment grew more and more obvious. He started making passive-aggressive remarks about how I controlled everything because I was the one with the money. It was like every decision I made became ammunition for him to use against me. I started questioning everything. Had he ever really loved me, or was he just in it for the money? The more I thought about it, the more I realized how much of our relationship had revolved around how much I was willing to spend on him. What I thought was love and mutual respect started to look more like dependence and manipulation. And that's when things really started to fall apart. Update 1. After we separated our finances, things between my husband and me changed drastically. What started as subtle resentment quickly turned into something much worse. He began making passive-aggressive comments about me being the breadwinner, something he couldn't seem to let go of. It didn't matter what I did, every decision became about control. If I suggested we tighten our spending or stick to a budget, he'd accuse me of trying to run everything because I had the money. It got to the point where he started guilting me into making large purchases, especially when we were around friends. He'd drop comments like it'd be nice if we could look a little more equal whenever we were with people. It was embarrassing. He was clearly uncomfortable with the imbalance, but instead of dealing with it constructively, he wanted to throw money at the issue, as if that would fix things. And the worst part? I caved more than I should have. I didn't want to cause a scene, so I'd agree to things I didn't really want to spend money on, just to keep the peace. Around this time, his behavior took another turn. He used to go out with his friends, occasionally, nothing out of the ordinary. But now it became every weekend. He'd stay out late, not coming home until the early hours of the morning. The friends he was spending time with weren't exactly the best influence either. They were the type who were always chasing get-rich-quick schemes, drinking too much, and living irresponsibly. It was like he was trying to escape from reality by surrounding himself with these people. Things escalated after a few months. One of my closest friends, who had never liked my husband much, told me something that stopped me in my tracks. She had overheard him at a party, bragging about how he had scored big by marrying a rich woman. I didn't want to believe her at first, but the way she described it left no room for doubt. I felt sick to my stomach. Was that really how he saw me? Just a ticket to an easy life? When I confronted him, he denied everything. Of course. He twisted the conversation around, accusing me of being insecure and paranoid. He acted like I was the one with the problem, making me question my own judgment. But deep down, I knew something was off. His attitude, his spending habits, and now this. It was too much to ignore. It wasn't long after that I discovered something even more troubling. He had started gambling, something I had no clue about. It came out of nowhere. He had never mentioned any interest in gambling before. But it turned out he had been going to casinos with his new friends and had racked up some significant losses. I couldn't believe it. Not only were we already dealing with financial strain because of his failed ventures, but now he was adding gambling debts to the mix. He asked me to help cover his losses, promising me it would be the last time. But I had reached my limit. I refused. I wasn't going to keep bailing him out, especially not for something like gambling. That's when he suggested we go to marriage counseling. He said we needed help, that maybe a therapist could fix things. I agreed, thinking maybe it was worth one last shot. But the counseling sessions didn't go the way I expected. Every session turned into him accusing me of being controlling and unsupportive. He made it sound like I was the one holding him back, like I wasn't giving him the space to grow or succeed. He admitted that he felt like a failure for not being able to match my success, and that insecurity had been eating at him for years. The therapist suggested that we create clear boundaries with our finances, and I immediately insisted on keeping everything separate. That seemed to set him off even more. He was furious about the idea, but I wasn't budging. I had already seen how blending our finances had led to disaster, and I wasn't about to let that happen again. Unfortunately, things didn't get better. His gambling addiction only worsened. He started disappearing for entire weekends, and I had no idea where he was or what he was doing. I'd be home alone wondering if he was losing more money, making bad decisions, or worse. The stress was unbearable. I couldn't sleep, and it started affecting my work. I was constantly on edge, worried about what he was going to do next. Then I found out that he had been borrowing money from friends and family behind my back. He was telling them that I had cut him off financially, making me look like the bad guy. I was furious, but more than that, I was hurt. How could he do this? He was dragging everyone into our mess, and I had no idea how to stop it. I started thinking about separating, maybe even divorcing him, but the guilt was overwhelming. I still loved him, despite everything. I didn't want to abandon him when he was clearly struggling, but at what cost? My own mental health was deteriorating, and I knew I couldn't keep going like this. My family eventually stepped in. They were worried about me, and they weren't shy about expressing their concerns. They told me I needed to think about my own well-being, that maybe he had married me for my money all along. It was a suspicion that had been creeping into my mind, but hearing them say it out loud made it feel more real. As much as I didn't want to believe it, the signs were all there, and the more I thought about it, the harder it was to deny. Update 2. It didn't take long for my husband's gambling addiction to spiral out of control. The late nights, the shady friends, the lies, it was all catching up to him, and I wasn't prepared for how bad things would get. One evening, I came home earlier than usual from work and noticed something strange. A few of my most expensive pieces of jewelry were missing, along with some other valuable items. My first thought was that we had been robbed, but nothing else seemed disturbed. I started checking around and realized what had actually happened. My husband had been selling off my things, trying to cover his gambling debts without me knowing. I couldn't believe it. This was a new low even for him. I confronted him, and for once he didn't try to deny it. He just stood there, looking ashamed. But shame wasn't enough. I told him I couldn't trust him anymore, that this marriage was falling apart, and I couldn't do this any longer. His reaction? A sob story about how he'd been under immense pressure, that he didn't mean to hurt me, and that he just wanted to fix everything. He begged for my forgiveness, but I wasn't falling for it. He had crossed too many lines, and I couldn't keep pretending things would get better. The final straw came a few days later. I was going through some documents for the house when I found something that made my heart sink. My husband had taken out a second mortgage on our home without telling me. He had risked everything I'd worked for, all to cover his gambling losses and whatever else he had gotten himself into. This wasn't just reckless, it was dangerous. If he kept going, we could lose the house, my business, everything. That was it for me. I was furious, heartbroken, and done with the excuses. I kicked him out of the house and immediately started the process of filing for a legal separation. I had to protect myself, both emotionally and financially. The betrayal was too deep, and at that point I realized I couldn't keep sacrificing my own stability for someone who clearly didn't care about anything except his own messes. As soon as he was out, my friends and family rallied around me. My parents, in particular, were livid. They had seen through him long before I did, but they had stayed quiet because they didn't want to push me away. They weren't surprised by any of this, but that didn't make it any less painful to deal with. Everyone offered their support, and for the first time in a long while, I felt like I wasn't carrying this burden alone. Meanwhile, my husband had hit rock bottom. He was broke, homeless, and had nowhere to go. He started calling me, begging to come back, saying he had no one else to turn to. He tried to guilt-trip me, accusing me of being heartless for leaving him when he was at his lowest. He painted himself as the victim, as if everything that had happened wasn't a result of his own choices. It didn't stop there. He started spinning stories to our mutual friends, telling them I had abandoned him because I only cared about money. He made it seem like I was the villain who couldn't handle things when times got tough. It was frustrating, but I didn't have the energy to defend myself to everyone. The truth was clear to those who mattered, and that was enough for me. Over time, I started seeing through all of his manipulative tactics. This entire time, he had been exploiting my kindness, my willingness to help, and my belief that he could change. He wasn't interested in fixing anything, he just wanted someone else to clean up the messes he kept making. I began going to therapy on my own, trying to work through the overwhelming guilt and betrayal I felt. My therapist helped me realize that his financial dependency had been a red flag from the beginning. I had ignored it, thinking that love could somehow make everything okay. But love isn't enough when someone refuses to take responsibility for their actions. Deep down, I had always known something was off, but I didn't want to see it. Therapy gave me the clarity I needed to start rebuilding my life. I threw myself back into my business and focused on my own growth, both personally and professionally. I started taking small steps to regain control, cutting off unnecessary communication with him, setting firm boundaries, and slowly finding my sense of self again. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary. My lawyer warned me that the divorce could get messy, especially with his gambling debts. It was likely he'd try to fight for some of my assets, despite contributing nothing but debt to our marriage. I was preparing for a long legal battle, but I was ready. I had already lost so much because of him, and I wasn't about to let him take any more from me. While I was picking up the pieces of my life, my husband continued to spiral. He refused to take responsibility for anything and kept blaming me for all of his problems. Every time I heard about what he was up to, whether it was begging for money from friends or refusing to get real help, I just felt more resolved in my decision. I couldn't save him, and I wasn't going to let him drag me down any further. I knew I still had a long way to go, but for the first time in a while, I felt like I was moving in the right direction. Update 3. The moment I officially filed for divorce, my husband's reaction was a messy combination of anger and desperation. He claimed he still loved me and begged me to reconsider, but I could tell that his real concern was losing access to my money. His attempts at manipulation were obvious. One minute, he was professing love. The next, he was lashing out in frustration. I didn't fall for it. I had made up my mind, and I was moving forward with the divorce no matter what. As expected, he didn't take it lying down. He immediately contested the divorce and began demanding a significant portion of my wealth as part of the settlement. He claimed that he had sacrificed his career for the marriage, conveniently ignoring the fact that his career had already been in shambles before we even got married. His lawyer started spinning this narrative that my money was marital property and that he was entitled to spousal support because he had contributed emotionally and domestically during our time together. It was laughable, really, but I knew things were about to get ugly. My legal team was prepared, though. They pushed back hard, highlighting his financial irresponsibility, his gambling addiction, and the fact that he had brought nothing but debt into the marriage. There was no way he was walking away with anything more than he deserved. But just when I thought I had a handle on the situation, another bombshell dropped. I discovered that he had maxed out several joint credit cards without my knowledge. He had racked up tens of thousands of dollars in additional debt, and now it was my responsibility to deal with it. I felt like I couldn't catch a break. Every time I thought I was getting ahead, something else surfaced, dragging me back into the mess. During this time, he kept trying to manipulate me emotionally. He would send me late-night texts, alternating between apologies, threats, and promises to change. It was exhausting. He'd beg for another chance, and when I didn't respond, he'd turn around and accuse me of being heartless. It was clear that he was still only concerned about one thing: money. He even had the audacity to accuse me of financial abuse, claiming that I had controlled all the finances and didn't give him the opportunity to grow. That accusation stung, but my lawyer reassured me that it was a weak, baseless claim. We gathered plenty of evidence to show how he had lived off my income, contributing next to nothing to the household while sinking us deeper into debt. When we finally got to court, his performance was dramatic, to say the least. He pleaded for spousal support, claiming that he was unable to sustain himself after sacrificing everything for the marriage. I had to fight the urge to roll my eyes. He acted as if he had been the victim all along, ignoring the fact that his gambling debts and reckless spending were the real reasons we were in this situation. The judge wasn't impressed, especially after hearing the full extent of his financial behavior. The details of his gambling addiction and the loans he took in my name made it clear that he was more interested in living off my success than actually contributing to our marriage. As the legal battle dragged on, his financial situation continued to deteriorate. He ended up moving in with one of his friends because he could no longer afford to live on his own. At one point, that same friend called me, asking if I could help him out because he was in a bad place. I couldn't believe it. Even after everything, he was still trying to involve me, still expecting me to clean up his messes. That call was my breaking point. It wasn't just me he had manipulated, it was everyone around him, and I had to draw a line. I realized then that I had been enabling him for far too long, and it had to stop. My therapist was a huge help during this time. She helped me see that setting firm boundaries was the only way to fully reclaim my life. I had spent years trying to fix things, trying to make the relationship work, but it was never going to happen. My husband didn't want to change. He didn't want to take responsibility. All he wanted was to keep using people until there was nothing left. Therapy helped me accept that following through with the divorce was the right decision, no matter how difficult it was. My family stood by me throughout the whole ordeal, reminding me that I was doing the right thing. Their support was invaluable, and they kept me grounded when things felt overwhelming. With their encouragement, I began cutting off all non-essential communication with my husband. Everything went through our lawyers. It was the only way to protect my peace of mind and keep him from dragging me into his drama. Despite his best efforts to drag out the legal process and drain me emotionally and financially, I stayed resolute. I refused to let him win. I had worked too hard to build my business and secure my future, and I wasn't about to let him take that from me. My focus was on protecting what I had built and moving forward with my life. The longer the process went on, the more I realized that I was stronger than I had given myself credit for. The divorce was messy, and it took time, but I was determined to come out of it with my dignity intact. My husband could blame me for everything, but the truth was clear to those who mattered. This was his mess, not mine, and I wasn't going to let him drag me down with him any longer. I was ready to rebuild my life, free from his manipulations, and finally take control of my own future. Update 4. As the divorce process reached its peak, my husband's financial situation went from bad to worse. He was scrambling, borrowing money from mutual friends, some of whom were starting to distance themselves from him. The endless excuses, the empty promises, it was all catching up to him. People were realizing that he was never going to pay them back, and more importantly, they were starting to see through his manipulations. I heard through the grapevine that some of our friends had stopped answering his calls entirely. In court, things got uglier. During one of the hearings, it came out that he had falsified some documents about his finances. He had tried to hide just how deep in debt he really was. I wasn't surprised, but it was still a shock to see how far he was willing to go to cover his tracks. The lies were piling up, and even his lawyer seemed uncomfortable with how much of a mess he had made. The judge wasn't buying any of it, either. In the end, the judge ruled that the bulk of the marital assets would remain with me. Most of what we had were things I had acquired before the marriage, and I had kept them separate for a reason. He was left with minimal compensation, which wasn't a shock to anyone. His lawyer made one last attempt, arguing for spousal support, but given all the evidence of his financial recklessness, the judge dismissed most of those claims. I thought that would be the end of it, but out of sheer desperation, my husband tried to appeal for more money. This time he argued that his gambling had been a coping mechanism for the stress of being married to someone with so much wealth. He tried to paint himself as the victim, as if his addiction was something I had caused. It was a weak argument, and the court rejected it quickly. They weren't going to reward someone who refused to take responsibility for their actions. His requests for additional support were denied. With the court case winding down and his options running out, my husband hit rock bottom. He started calling and texting me more frequently, blaming me for everything that had gone wrong in his life. He refused to see that his own actions had led him to this point. One night, he left a series of drunken voicemails, alternating between begging for my forgiveness and threatening to expose all of my secrets. Of course, I knew there were no secrets, but it was unsettling to hear him make those kinds of threats. At that point, I'd had enough. I blocked him on every platform. Any necessary communication would go through our lawyers from that point forward. After I did that, I felt an immediate sense of relief. It was as if a massive weight had been lifted off my shoulders. But even with that relief, I knew there was still a lot of emotional healing to do. I had been through a roller coaster of manipulation, betrayal, and stress. But the scars were deep, and I knew it would take time to fully recover. As I reflected on our marriage, the red flags I had ignored became so obvious. The constant excuses, the manipulation, the way he always made his financial problems feel like they were somehow my responsibility. It was clear that this pattern had been there from the start, but I had been too blind to see it. Love had clouded my judgment, and I had let myself be taken advantage of. Around this time, the media got wind of the divorce. Due to my family's business, the story caught some attention, and a few minor articles were written about it. I tried to keep a low profile, but I couldn't completely avoid the spotlight. It was frustrating, but there was little I could do about it. Luckily, it didn't turn into a huge scandal, and most of the attention died down after a while. Mutual friends started reaching out to me, telling me that my husband was now openly bad-mouthing me, trying to gain sympathy wherever he could. He spun stories about how I had abandoned him, making it seem like I was the villain. But as more people realized what he had been doing behind the scenes, some of them cut ties with him completely. It became clear that he had been manipulating them, too. His reputation was crumbling, and he had no one to blame but himself. In therapy, my therapist encouraged me to focus on my own healing and stop worrying about what people thought. She helped me realize that, despite everything, I still felt guilty for how things had ended. I had spent so much time trying to save him, trying to fix things, that I had forgotten about myself in the process. I had allowed myself to be manipulated by guilt for far too long, and it was time to let go of that. Finally, the divorce was finalized. The settlement was mostly in my favor, and I felt like I could finally start to move on. But while the legal battle was over, the emotional toll remained. I knew it would take time to fully recover from everything I had been through. Trusting someone again seemed like a distant possibility, but I was determined to focus on rebuilding my life. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the constant anxiety, free from the manipulation, and free from the weight of a toxic relationship. It wasn't going to be an easy road, but I was ready to take it one step at a time. The future was uncertain, but it was mine again, and that was enough. Update 5. Several months after the divorce was finalized, I finally had the space to reflect on how much my life had changed. The constant tension, the emotional roller coaster, it was all behind me now. I could focus on myself and my business, and despite everything that had happened, my business was thriving. In fact, it felt like I was doing even better than before. The personal turmoil had been draining, but it had also forced me to realign my priorities. Work became an outlet, and I poured myself into it. In contrast, my ex-husband's life had fallen apart. Through mutual friends, I heard that he was completely broke. He was couch surfing, bouncing from one friend's place to another, and struggling to find a stable job. His attempts to start new businesses had all failed miserably. It wasn't surprising. He had burned too many bridges, and people finally saw him for what he was, a user. His charm had run out, and now he had nothing to fall back on. Meanwhile, I was working on reclaiming my confidence and sense of self-worth. Therapy was a huge part of that process. I hadn't realized just how much I had let my ex take advantage of me emotionally, financially, and mentally. It was like waking up from a long, bad dream. I had been so wrapped up in trying to fix things, trying to make the relationship work, that I had lost sight of myself in the process. Slowly, I started to rebuild. I began setting clear boundaries, something I had struggled with before. I had learned my lesson the hard way. I even started dating again, but I was taking things slow. After everything I had been through, I was much more cautious about letting people get too close too soon. I wasn't going to let anyone get anywhere near my finances or my trust without earning it. I wasn't bitter or cynical, but I was definitely more aware now. It was a necessary change. My relationship with my family also improved dramatically during this time. They had always been supportive, but there had been tension before, especially when they suspected my ex-husband was taking advantage of me. Now that was all in the past, and I felt more connected to them than ever. I was grateful that they never pushed me too hard during the divorce. They gave me space when I needed it and stood by me when I finally saw the truth for myself. Then, one day I received a letter from my ex-husband. It was out of the blue and completely unexpected. In the letter, he apologized for everything he had done. He admitted that he had married me for my money but claimed that he grew to love me later. It was hard to read, and for a moment I almost let myself get pulled back into his web of manipulation. But I didn't respond. I had moved on, and there was no way I was going to let him back into my life. My therapist helped me process the apology. She encouraged me to accept it for what it was but not to dwell on it or allow it to reopen old wounds. From what I heard, my ex-husband continued to struggle. He was still trying to reach out to people, including some of my family members, asking for money or help, but they all refused. They had seen through his manipulative ways just as I had, and no one was willing to get involved. A part of me felt pity for him, but I knew that his situation was the result of his own choices. I had given him more chances than he deserved, and now he had to face the consequences. Despite everything that had happened, I was doing well. I had taken up new hobbies, started traveling more, and was actively investing in my own happiness. It felt like I had finally regained control of my life. I even started a blog, documenting my journey through financial independence, relationships, and self-worth. It was therapeutic for me, and I hoped that by sharing my story, I could help others avoid the traps I had fallen into. Every now and then, I'd reflect on how close I came to losing everything: my wealth, my business, and my sense of self, all because I had trusted the wrong person. It was a sobering thought, but I wasn't angry anymore. I was just relieved that I had escaped before things got any worse. My financial advisors were still helping me manage my wealth, ensuring that my future remained secure, and I felt confident that I was back on the right path. In the end, I realized that I had become stronger and wiser through the experience. I knew I would never let anyone take advantage of me like that again. The emotional scars were still there, but they were healing, and I was ready to face whatever came next. My story wasn't over, but this chapter was finally closed. And with that, I knew I had learned the most important lesson of all: I deserved better, and I would never settle for less again.